In this lecture, we're going to start talking about our first organ system of the year, which is the integumentary system. Remember from earlier in the book when we started talking about different kinds of the parts of the body, two or more tissues grouped together for a specific job is called an organ. And the integumentary system actually houses the largest organ in the human body, which is the skin, believe it or not. So you might remember the integumentary system includes the skin, hair, nails, and then a whole bunch of receptors and glands that we will talk more about in the next lecture. There are some fun random facts for you here. Your hair has a lifespan of about 3 to 7 years, and you may have already known that your fingernails grow a lot faster than your toenails, but did you know that it was 6 times faster? In fact, the middle finger nail, that is, grows the fastest, while your thumb grows the slowest. Some of the jobs of the skin we've talked a little bit about already. To maintain homeostasis, generally speaking, that is done by regulating temperature. It keeps your body right around 37 degrees Celsius. It provides protection from things outside the body that we certainly don't want inside the body. It helps to hold water, which is a huge part of homeostasis as well. It allows us to interact with our environment and tell what is happening around us. The skin also makes really important chemicals, such as vitamin D, which we use the energy from sunlight in order to stimulate the production of vitamin D, which is very interesting. And your skin also helps to make certain hormones that help with immunity or disease response. And your skin helps excrete waste, which is interesting and something that most people don't think of, and it does this through sweat. That's another thing we'll talk more about in the next lecture. When we look at the layers of the skin, there are basically 3 layers. We're going to start on the outside and work our way in. So the outermost layer of the skin is called the epidermis. Epi means around, dermis means skin. So it's the outermost layer, and it's made up of a certain kind of cell called stratified squamous. These cells are very, very flat, usually pretty long. They don't have much happening inside of them. There aren't really nuclei and a bunch of organelles because all of these layers of cells are dead. The next layer, which is basically this whole part of this diagram, is called the dermis. The dermis is much thicker than the epidermis, and it includes most of the important parts of the skin, the connective tissue, so it holds the dead epidermis to the fatty layer underneath. It involves epithelial tissue, which means skin cell tissue. There's a lot of muscle in this area, and there's a lot of nerves. So those are basically all of the 4 tissue types in the human body, and they can all be found in the skin, and specifically within the dermis. There are tons and tons of blood vessels, and there is a structure that you can't see too well in this picture, but it lies right along here. It's called the basement membrane. Actually, I drew that at the bottom rather than at the top, which is not what I meant to do. The basement membrane lies you can sort of see it here in this darker line. It attaches the epidermis, or those dead skin cells, to the thicker dermis layer below. The very most inside layer is right here. This is called the subcutaneous, so sub means below. Cutaneous usually refers to the skin. It's another word for dermis. So the subcutaneous layer contains a lot of connective tissue. So connective tissue does just what you would expect. It connects 2 parts together. And in this case, the connective tissue helps to connect your skin to the inner part of your body. And it also contains a lot of blood vessels, which connect the entire body together. The biggest part of the subcutaneous layer is fat. So the fat helps to insulate, and this is where the temperature regulation comes into play. The fat helps to hold heat and keep you warm. The skin has a lot of different parts that we deal with every day, and it has a lot of different jobs that you maybe don't think about every day. Your skin, if you weigh 150 pounds, which probably not a lot of people in class do, we've got a lot of still very small little ladies, but an 150-pound person has about 10 pounds of skin, so slightly less if you weigh under 150 pounds, and it covers 20 square feet. For some reason, my little exponent turned big there. But 20 square feet of skin. So if we skinned you and laid it all out, you would have 20 square feet. That's a lot of skin, surprisingly. And one of the ways that we receive medications is going through the skin layer in a couple of different ways. The first one is called intradermal, which means inside the skin. So this, if you've ever had an allergy test or a TB test, that's this kind of shot where it's just injected right underneath the skin, and then it's easy to see how it affects that tissue. There's a subcutaneous, which you just learned that term. So these injections go into the fatty layer beneath the skin. Things like insulin are delivered there because they are easily absorbed into fat and then can spread to the rest of the body. And then below that layer is the muscles of the body. So an intramuscular shot goes directly into the muscle itself. Things like flu shots, tetanus shots, this is where they give those because the muscles can, again, the medicine found in those shots is most easily absorbed into muscle and then delivered to the rest of the body. You can also have, most of the time, this type of medication is a pain medication. It's called a Transdermal Patch, and it's a sticky, flat patch, really, the word is correct. And it's laid on top of the skin and it sticks to the skin, and the medication is absorbed directly that way. So rather than injecting it into the body, it's absorbed through the skin and into the blood. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these layers a little bit more specifically. So the epidermis, I already told you, is made up of cells that are called squamous. Sometimes, depending on the text, you'll also hear the word basal or stratum basale. Stratum just means layer, so this is a layer of cells called the basal layer, and it gets a lot of its food and nutrition from blood supply. So the blood supplies food and oxygen to these cells, and they push from deep inside the body. Imagine that this is inside your body and this is outside your body. The cells are fed by blood supply inside the body, and then as new cells are grown, the old cells begin to die and they get pushed outward until eventually they are shed from the body, right? You shed skin all the time. As the layers of cells get further and further from this blood source on the inside, they get less and less food, less and less oxygen, so they die. The further out they get, the older they are. As they get towards the edge of the skin, a process called keratinization happens. Keratin is a protein that is super prevalent in the body, found in hair and nails and in skin. And it causes some hardening of the structures that it's found in. And so as these cells get further and further from the inside of the body, they get filled with more and more and more keratin, so they get harder and harder and harder, and drier and drier and drier, until eventually you get these tough, tightly packed cells that are up on the surface of the skin that get shed. The 4 layers of skin cells that you will find in the epidermis, stratum basale is the bottom, right? And so we just talked about that. They include the biggest variety of cells, some that make protein, some that make another protein called melanin, some that make immune cells, and then a bunch of nerves. The next layer up is called the Stratum Spinosum. This is where we first start to see the keratin filling up the cells. The next layer is called Stratum Granulosum. Granule means it's starting to be pretty tightly packed. And then the uppermost layer is the Stratum Corneum. These are all dead, and these cells are just for protection. They don't have any protein-producing cells, and they don't have any other job. So you will find the epidermis on all of the outside of the body. The thickest layers are found on the palms of the hands and the bottom of the feet, because these are the areas that most interact with the environment. And they often have a 5th extra layer of cells called the stratum lucidum, which just involves more keratinized cells that provide extra thickness and protection in those layers. I told you that we would talk about another protein called melanin, and here we go. So there are cells within the skin called melanocytes. Remember, cyte means cell, and melano refers to melanin. So these are just special cells that produce melanin. The melanin in your body is what gives you your skin color. If you happen to have freckles, it's responsible for those freckles. It's also responsible for some of your hair color. Melanin absorbs UV light, sort of like a plant, right? Plants have chlorophyll, you have melanin. So when your body comes into contact with UV light, the melanocytes absorb that light and it tells them to make melanin. As you make more melanin, your skin cells get darker and darker. This is why our skin tans when we're in the sun. We absorb extra UV light. The extra light tells the melanocytes to make melanin. As more melanin is made, your skin gets darker and you appear tanner. If you happen to be a person who has naturally tanner skin or darker complexion, that's because your body produces more melanocytes. Actually, not more melanocytes, but more melanin within those melanocytes. So we all have the same number of cells, but not everybody's body is triggered to make more melanin. Those of us, like myself, who have very little melanin in their skin and therefore look very fair, tend to be pretty pink colored. That means that I have a high oxygen content, right? My skin has a lot of blood vessels that are carrying lots of oxygen, and so that causes my skin to look a lot pinker. If you have more melanin, then the brown coloring tends to overshadow that pink and you look more tan or olive complected. There can be some problems within the cells of the epidermis. Two of the most common difficulties with the integumentary system come in the form of skin cancer. This is one of the most common cancers in the world. Of the skin cancer types, the most common is called a cutaneous or skin carcinoma. This tends to happen in people with very light skin, so people who live in northern parts of the world, and generally in people 40 and older. You often will see this type of skin cancer in places where there is a lot of sun exposure. So the neck, face, and scalp are the most common regions, although back of the hands, shoulders, things like that also happen. And these can usually be removed surgically. So the whole dark patch is usually how it appears, can be removed right from the skin, and it generally doesn't cause more problems. A more serious form of skin cancer is called a cutaneous melanoma. So here you go, you see melanin again. So this is a tumor of the melanocytes themselves. And so what happens is the melanin gets overproduced and it starts to produce a chemical that is toxic or harmful. And so what happens is rather than appearing tanner, the melanin often will produce these kind of off shadows of blue or black or even gray. This is not usually a sun-related issue. It's not so much, well, you were out in the sun a lot as a child, but it's you were out in the sun at some point or in a tanning bed or had some kind of exposure that was really severe and it caused blistering or a really, really severe burn. And so we tend to find these cancers in the back, arms, legs. They're very difficult to treat, especially if the tumor spreads from the surface of the skin. Let's say this is the skin, and the chemicals start to infect cells deep within the skin, which is very hard to see from the outside. So if it spreads to inside cells or bones or inner tissues, it can be very, very serious. All right, so moving on to the dermis. The thickest layer of the skin is the dermis, and it has these very interesting little ridges called the dermal papillae, which you guys are all familiar with, you just didn't know it. Papillae just means a bump or a ridge. This is what gives us our fingerprints, and strangely enough, your fingerprints develop while you are growing inside your mom as a fetus. And the reason that we have our fingerprints is because babies or fetuses will rub the inside walls of the placenta, and that rubbing causes permanent ridges in their fingers and therefore fingerprints, which is why not even identical twins have identical fingerprints. This is not a DNA-based thing. It's a how you acted as you were growing as a teeny tiny little fetus, how your hands moved and what they touched and how often they touched. And that's what forms your fingerprints, which I think is totally fascinating. The dermis is connected to the epidermis above. So the epidermis, then dermis, then subcutaneous layer. So the dermis is connected to these two parts above and below by tough elastic connective tissue, which allows the skin to stretch and be strong. There are huge volumes of blood supply and nerves in the body to supply nutrients and to communicate information back and forth about temperature, about whether things are hard or soft or fuzzy or smooth. And that allows for important muscular responses within the body. There are also a lot of hair follicles and sweat glands, which we will talk more about in the next lecture. Another interesting fact about the skin that you may not have known is that while all of your epidermal cells, those are the outermost layer of cells, while all of those get shed and cast off the body as they die, your dermal cells never do. Dermal cells are permanent. This is why tattoos actually reach down into the dermal layer of the skin, and the ink is absorbed by those cells, and those cells stay there forever. They may stretch out, they may, change their shape a little bit over time, but they are never shed, which is why tattoos are permanent. Here's just a picture of some of the nerve cells found within the dermis. The two big ones are called the Meissner's corpuscles. How's that for a mouthful? You can see that a gentleman named Meissner discovered these first. These are found kind of in the fingerprint parts of the dermis, and they are touch receptors. They are super sensitive to light touches, things like clothes brushing against them, or wind, or hair, or a spider, crawling across your skin. That kind of thing is detected by the Meissner's corpuscles. And so, I don't know why this formatting got all kooky, but you can find these particular nerves mostly in the fingertips and the lips. Those are the two most sensitive parts of your skin. Much deeper down in the dermis are some cells called the Paxinian corpuscles, and again, very strange term, but it looks like this. It's this, you can see it's much larger than the Meissner. It's this whole white structure here, and it is much more receptive to changes in pressure and vibration. So these are the ones when you have a significant injury, say you get, hit in the leg by a baseball, right? This is the receptor that's going to feel that, because that's a high pressure situation. It's not a light touch situation. So there are different receptors for those different jobs. Okay, that leads us to the end of our lecture today. So this is what you should know from this lecture. What are the functions of the skin? What are the layers? How are the layers different? Generally speaking, what happens in each layer? How do you have the skin color that you have? And what are some ways that you can damage your skin, either by choice or by accident? You should also come in with 3 discussion questions. You must have questions that were not addressed in this lecture, and we will talk about them. Thank you.